This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
Significant and protracted
political
theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. The current Congress started off last year with an historic show of dysfunction, taking 15 rounds of voting to elect a speaker. Things did not get any better as that speaker eventually got deposed and then quit Congress altogether. And while it is early in this year, it looks like we are in for more of the same. This week, we saw the House and the Senate devolve into what some observers dubbed failure theater. One Senator, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, asked simply, "What the hell just happened?" Helping us answer that question is Molly Reynolds. She's a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, who we welcome back to the Political Theater podcast. Hello, Molly.
Hello, Jason. Thanks for having me back.
It's a pleasure to have you. And I feel like we have to start almost at sort of the beginning. Just reciting the facts seems almost it just kind of helps, I think, to process some of this. I'm writing a column right now where I just start with the first part of the day on Monday when Mike Johnson announced that the whole number of the House was down to 431 because Brian Higgins, a Democrat from the Buffalo area in the House, had quit to take a job at a performing arts center or something like that. Something, which seems like, people used to think of Congress maybe as a somewhat nice, good job to have. But Brian Higgins was like, I think I'm ready to run a performing arts center in Buffalo. And that put into motion some of what we saw later, which was that the House proceeded to, move on impeachment articles against the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. And part of that was made possible because they felt that they had the votes with Higgins gone. So the next day, we saw, both, Democrats and Republicans disagree on whether impeachment is justified. But then we saw what we saw on Tuesday night when the House brought those impeachment articles up was I have a hard time remembering a time when I've seen such dysfunction and failure. The failure theater thing really does, sort of come to mind. That phrase stuck in my head, and I'm curious your thoughts about like what you were thinking when you're seeing this go down.
Yeah, so it's, unusual for us to see a vote fail unpredictably on the floor of either the House or the Senate, but probably at least before this Congress, especially the House, where, it's relatively uncommon for a majority party to have as slim a majority as the current Republican conference does, and particularly on the kinds of things that the leadership decides to bring to the floor, we generally expect that, they don't bring something to the floor unless they have the votes. Nancy Pelosi is famous for saying, like, first you count the votes and then you take the vote. And that you don't...
That seems very old-fashioned now.
And so in that sense, sort of bringing these articles of impeachment against Secretary Mayorkas to the floor without a firm grasp on the whip count, or in this case, sort of a firm grasp on the attendance situation, was surprising in some part, at least to me, because there's no... we don't really think there's a chance that the Senate is going to convict Secretary Mayorkas of. So even if the House had passed the articles of impeachment, like they're not. The Senate would have to probably dispose of them in some way. Right. Revisiting the Senate's impeachment trial rules is something that's like buried in the back of my head from 3 and 4 years ago, respectively. But they'd have to do something if an articles came over from the House. But there's no sort of substantive clock in the way that there might be if we were talking about a measure to keep the government open or something like that.
Right.
So in that sense, it is sort of surprising. It's also a little bit surprising. So there's some reporting out today where Ken Buck, who was one of the three Republicans to vote, I believe there were three of them to vote against the Mayorkas impeachment articles, where he said that he had been publicly opposed to impeachment for quite some time, and he has this quote that says, and I'm reading here, Speaker Johnson never called me. And then he basically says that if McCarthy had called him, he would have yelled. Mike knows me well enough not to yell. And Bader would have broken my arm. And so just this like sense of this evolution of the House Republican leadership in this time of a vanishingly narrow majority and real challenges at getting things of legislative consequence done on the
Basic
floor as
funding
well.
bills, right?
Yes, yes. And so, yes, you're sort of right to start our discussion of the week with sort of Mayorkas episode, but we can talk about some other sort of
before we let the Mayorkas thing go. I mean, I just want to set the scene for I have finally realized that there are people not like you and me who are either in the chamber or are glued to C-SPAN for these sort of episodes. But it really was extraordinary. We rarely see a packed house. Only on pretty significant votes. Even when the full house is voting on something, people usually just stick their cards in the card, the card reader, yes or no, and then they leave. They're out to go to a fundraiser or something, right? It was a packed house. There was a real sense of like they didn't know what was going on. It ended up in a tie vote, 215 to 215. 3 Republicans voted with all Democrats. And then at the end, one of the members of the leadership team, Blake Moore, who's a Republican from Utah, he changed his vote so they can, in a procedural move, so they can bring it back up.
He's now had to try and explain that to his constituents.
Right. Yeah.
I try to explain congressional procedure for a living. It's not easy. And it's definitely not easy if you're a member who all of a sudden now has a lot of attention on you for changing your vote for a procedural.
And it's also a relatively new member too. I mean, he's isn't some crusty old guy, who's been doing this for, decades. And it was extraordinary too, because I mean, the as you said, they weren't even quite sure who was going to show up. And there was this almost ghoulish proceedings, where they brought Hal Rogers, who's the 86-year-old dean of the House, a Republican from Kentucky. He'd been in a car accident last month, and he comes in with this incredibly formidable neck brace. One of the reporters next to me in the gallery said, like, he's going to have to rely on somebody else to tell him that they got his vote right on the voting board because he can't move his neck. He can't like look up. And so, this is an 86-year-old man who's in a car accident, who's like immobilized. It's something like out of a Coen Brothers movie or something. And then at the last instant, when when the Republicans thought that they had the vote, they had a 215-214 vote tally. They wheel in Al Green, the Democrat from Texas who had abdominal surgery on Friday. He's in a hospital gown, and he votes, no to not things at 215. And as it was this weird thing. They kept the vote open for more than a half an hour. Johnson looked like somebody had run over his dog. He was trying to figure out what to do. He's huddling with his leadership team and his staff. They finally called the vote after Moore changed his vote. And then immediately, everybody files out. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has been one of the chief architects of the impeachment drive against Mayorkas, said, we're just going to come back next week as soon as we possibly can. We're going to get Steve Scalise, the majority leader, back. And again, more sort of ghoulishness there because, this guy has cancer. He's been getting chemotherapy, back home. And they want him to come just to cast a vote to impeach somebody for a futile exercise for a trial that will go nowhere in the Senate. And I just thought this is such a high level of dysfunction. And then again, the math may change. I mean, they may get Scalise back depending on if he's well enough to travel. But then there's a special election on Tuesday in New York, which may very well elect a Democrat, again, changing the calculus again. It just
Right.
feels
And
incredibly unstable.
there's no telling what else could happen. We didn't, there was no ability to predict that last month Hal Rogers was going to be in a car accident,
Right.
and any number of things that can happen to members. I'll note one thing, which is that I have done a fair amount of work on the House's experience with proxy voting between the middle of 2020 and the end of 2022, which was initially created under the Democratic majority as a COVID era adaptation to allow members medically vulnerable members to not have to travel to Washington, to mean that there were fewer people on the floor of the House, all sorts of things. It was, challenged in court by Kevin McCarthy and other Republican lawmakers. Republicans chose to get rid of it when they took the majority at the beginning of 2023. And I will just say that if proxy voting had still been around, this would have solved their problem.
They wouldn't have to rouse people from hospital beds or chemotherapy, to vote.
And so I think, again, as we think about sort of like the institutional context in the House, is that we have this period of very narrow majorities, this desire on the part of the majority party. This isn't new, to sort of use the House to move things, even if they are dead on arrival in the Senate.
Right.
But it is. I think we should think about the effort to impeach Mayorkas as kind of the next step in the evolution of, you use the word feudal, sort of feudal impeachments. This idea that the impeachment power is something that the House now sometimes turns to, even when they know that the Senate is not likely to take to ultimately convict the individual who's been impeached by the House.
It's almost like a vote of no confidence, like in a parliament.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and one question this raises is, does the U.S. Congress in our current environment, if not a vote of no confidence, but like need a procedural tool to be able to do that doesn't rise to the level of, say, impeachment. But that's sort of a bigger question, I think, as we think about like how the House and frankly also the Senate can and should function in this time of like very high polarization and very narrow majorities and divisions within the two parties in both chambers.
So before we talk about the Senate, I feel like the next vote that night was is almost like a bridge to what we're going to talk about in the Senate with their border security and supplemental for Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan, which is Speaker Johnson again, bowing to the sort of the fact that he's not going to be able to get a lot of votes on party lines because he's got so many people he's got a pretty unified Democratic opposition, and then he just doesn't have the votes all the time within his own conference. So he started putting must pass bills on the suspension calendar, and this is a procedure that enables them to pass things as long without a rule, without going to the Rules Committee, and it enables them to pass it, but it's got to be with a supermajority, so it has to have overwhelming support. Kind of like this in the Senate for a lot of things, a lot of legislation. And so he's used this to muscle through the most recent continuing resolutions, which have allowed the government to remain funded until March, because he can count on Democrats to give him enough of a cushion, along with some members of his party, to pass these bills, and he doesn't have to worry about the Freedom Caucus, say, or some deficit hawks or so forth. And so he tried to do this with a supplemental bill that was going to be just about Israel. They didn't want to talk about Ukraine, and he said that they don't want to deal with the border security, package that was being negotiated on a bipartisan basis, in the sense they were just going to do Israel. Everybody agrees on this. Everybody should want this. And of course it failed. It needed 260 votes. It got 250. Both Democrats and Republicans voted against it. And it just seems like the thing that they thought that they had, that's just like, oh, we'll just put must pass bills on the suspension calendar and everybody will do it. And Democrats, will give us the cushion. Even that doesn't work now.
Yeah. So I want to, before I talk about the Israel bill specifically, I just want to dwell on this sort of pivot by Johnson to using the suspension calendar or suspension of the rules in this way. This is sort of, at least in the contemporary era, a historical development. So, we have long thought of the majority party in the House as acting as a very strong procedural majority, if not a sort of policy majority, or having agreement on all of the substance that folks might want to take up. There's sort of long been this understanding that your responsibility as a member of the majority party is to vote with the party on procedural votes, to vote with the party on these special rule votes, so these votes that occur before the vote on the bill itself, that the rule sets the terms of debate on the underlying bill. How many amendments, how long are they going to debate it for, that sort of thing. And that it is a responsibility of you as a member of the majority party to vote with your party on these votes, because the Speaker of the House gets to, working with the other members of the majority party leadership, gets to set the agenda, and your job is to help make sure that what the decisions they have made are the ones that can, about what should be on the floor, that can actually happen. And we've seen over the past 9 months or so, just a real departure from this norm among Republicans in the House. And so and some of this is related to the fact that when Speaker McCarthy, or former Speaker McCarthy, was elected to that position a little over a year ago, he had to make a series of concessions to folks within the Republican conference. One of those concessions was an agreement to put several kind of Freedom Caucus aligned members on the Rules Committee. So there's some set of things where Johnson is now turning to suspension of the rules to move them, because he feels like they can't get through rules because you have these sort of dissident Republicans on that committee who won't vote for a rule in committee. And then there, I think, are other situations where we have seen some rules themselves fail on the floor because you have other Republicans who are trying to take that part of the process hostage to get things that they want. So I just want to make sure that our listeners who don't necessarily spend a ton of time thinking about what is suspension of the rules, understand that it's really unusual that we've gotten to this point where Speaker Johnson is feeling like he needs to turn to this process. I have joked repeatedly that I do a fair amount of, lecturing to audiences of various kinds. And I have PowerPoint slides about, legislative procedure in the House. And I absolutely have a line that says that suspension of the rules is usually used for non-controversial measures. And now I have to go in and change that because Mike Johnson is innovating in this context because he has to.
It's for naming post offices and multi-billion-dollar supplemental funding packages.
Yeah, and it's just you have these suspension votes you often have them at the very beginning of the week. They are the first set of votes that the House will take in a given week, and sometimes people talk about them as bed check votes to make sure that people are actually have returned to town and are ready to do the balance with the work for the week. And so, just thinking about that broader context, then we have this specific question, or we're going to talk, I think, about the Senate in a minute, but we have this kind of puzzle that is currently vexing members in both chambers about a set of priorities on which there are probably in both chambers a majority support for. But the majorities that support these things are non-overlapping. You have what the White House wants, what the White House is asking for, and you have the broader political context of the presidential election and sort of former President Trump out there in the wings, kind of looming over all of this. And so you get to the point where Johnson feels like he needs to turn to the suspension process to move this Israel-only bill. You have some number of Republicans who don't want to provide additional assistance for Israel without corresponding cuts to probably to the IRS. That was what they put in the version that they passed back in, I think, November. And then you have some number of Democrats who oppose additional assistance for Israel because they are unhappy with a whole range of things about the U.S. role, about sort of the conduct of the Israeli military intervention into Gaza. So you have those Democrats. Then you have Democrats who might be generally supportive of additional aid to Israel, but are responding to the fact that the Biden administration has said that Joe Biden would veto an Israel-only bill because what the Biden administration really wants is also to get additional assistance for Ukraine out of this. And so you have like all these pieces. It's in this broader political context, and it is becoming or continuing to be very difficult to figure out a way to put them together.
Yeah, and I think that you've hit it like so well there, because the consequence, a lot of people, I think, look at Congress and they're like, oh, that's just them becoming more dysfunctional than before. That's not really news. These are literally the biggest questions of our lives right now. Whether Ukraine or Russia will retain more of the territory of like a sovereign country in Ukraine, whether more people will starve to death in Gaza. Whether China will feel more comfortable in encroaching on Taiwan. And then also like the border, which is, all these issues are interlinked. And as you said, there's a majority support for some sort of version of this. It's just not coming within the parties themselves. So let's move over to the Senate, because this was, it felt like on Tuesday that it was almost like, oh, you think that's dysfunctional, House? Hold my beer. Months ago, the calculus that had been forming was, okay, we can do Ukraine aid. This from the perspective of a lot of House Republicans and some Senate Republicans. We can do Ukraine aid, but it's got to be coupled with a border security package that basically gets operational control over the border, and maybe changes the asylum system and so forth, because this is an issue that is polling. Like, people are very concerned about the immigration. Republicans think that it's a winning issue for them in an election year. Certainly, Donald Trump has said as much. And so, a couple of like really policy-oriented senators, got down to brass tacks and started negotiating. James Lankford, a Republican from Oklahoma, very conservative guy, very serious guy, was tapped by Mitch McConnell, the minority leader. Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, the what the hell just happened guy, was tapped by Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, and then Kyrsten Sinema, the independent senator from Arizona, my home state, which is seen, it's not, Texas gets more of the attention, but obviously Arizona has a huge border with Mexico where, a lot of these issues are coming up. The three of them were the lead negotiators on this. They spent 4 months working on this. They thought that they had a good package. Donald Trump says, I don't want this package. It kind of disappears overnight, leaving Lankford holding the bag, to the point where people in his own negotiating team, said that they wouldn't support it, like Tom Tillis. and this leads Murphy to say, like, what is happening? Like, we literally produced what you said you wanted, and now you say you don't want. And that, to me, that is the epitome of bad faith negotiations. The people had good faith in negotiating, and then as soon as they got what they wanted, others just pulled the rug out from under them.
Yeah, and I think we can, or I can certainly sort of offer an explanation of why this is where we ended up. But but at the end of the day, it's, I think, for people who care about kind of the health of the institution over the medium to the long term, it is deeply problematic to live in a world where people are asked, deputized to go and try and work out a compromise. And I'm not an immigration policy expert. Immigration policy experts, I think, have raised a range of questions about what this would actually do. Would it actually do any of the things that people say that they want out of a major immigration law change? It's a the amount of change that was in that language is significant. But at the end of the day, Murphy and Sinema and Lankford sat down and said, we are going to try and to work out an agreement. And it's sort of concerning, again, from an institutional perspective, that they did that. And then within 24 hours, maybe 48 hours of releasing the agreement that they had come to, the sort of politics swamped any possibility of moving that substantive agreement. And I think it's also important to just highlight how basically what Republicans could not say yes to. These are big changes, and to kind of put it in some historical context, we've had over the past decade or so, actually longer than that, almost 20 years, a series of attempts by particularly groups in the Senate across party lines to reach big compromises on immigration. You start with kind of the McCain-Kennedy proposal in 2006, 2007, 2000-ish. You have the Gang of Eight in 2013. You have this effort at the beginning of 2018 where the Senate votes on like 4 separate ideas. In all of those negotiations, it was kind of an article of faith for Democrats that whatever Republicans were going to demand, that the Democratic demand in exchange was going to be some kind of path to citizenship, some sort of pathway to legalization for individuals who were here and undocumented. And that included, at various points, kind of fixes for the Dreamers,
Right.
individuals who were brought to this country by their parents before they were 18. And so none of that was in this proposal. Right. So it is what Democrats were willing to give up to Republicans in this negotiation to try and get to what Republicans said they wanted, which was a big change in immigration law around the operations of the southern border, and then get the other thing that Democrats have said that they want, and also that many Republicans want, which is additional assistance to Ukraine, and then to sort of have that all fall apart because of these broader political forces it doesn't say anything good about kind of our long-term future in trying to incentivize compromise. I don't want to sort of elevate bipartisanship as kind of a goal in its own right, but in a world where the filibuster exists in the Senate and neither party is going to have a 60-vote majority, working across party lines to try and get things that can move to the Senate is a reality of our institutions. And so this is really one way to think about it is, why would Jim Lankford or anyone else like Lankford, who is a very conservative senator, but is sort of dispositionally someone who came to Washington to try to get things done, why would any of them kind of take up a charge from their conference going forward if they believe that the conference isn't going to stand behind them when it comes time to actually vote on the thing?
Yeah, I find it deeply depressing because it's a signal also that if you do the work, you will not be rewarded, because legislating is hard. I mean, there's no 2 ways around it. Ranting and raving on Twitter and at political rallies and demonizing people in a campaign is not nearly as difficult. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a part of politics. It's always been a part of politics. I mean, going way before you and I were born, before in the young days of the country, people have been, using political dirty tricks and campaign tactics and demonizing the other side. That is not a new thing, but there have always been people who have been willing to do the work, the hard work of actually legislating, of coming up with new policy. It would be as if a company that produced, say, phones was like, we're going to let the engineers work on a new phone. And then as soon as they're done, we're just going to trash them, fire them, or demoralize them, and then just go on a marketing blitz about how great we are.
Yeah,
it's just a signal like your good work is not appreciated and will not be rewarded.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about sort of the broader challenges facing the U.S. Congress, this idea that it has become a place where people say things as opposed to a place where people do things is a real problem for the future of our democracy, for the future of it as a legislative body trying to solve and address the problems that face the country. I admit it's not always easy, but I remain an eternal optimist about the possibilities of Congress as a representative body in our democracy. But when the incentives cut against really sitting down and figuring out the details of what a policy change that might be able to get through look like, that just that makes it really hard to see a productive future, and also presents big separation of powers challenges. Because one of the sort of arguments that you have heard Republicans make this week as to why they have walked away from this deal that Langford negotiated is this: actually, we don't need new law because the president has all the power he needs to do things on the border, and President Biden just isn't doing it. Which, again, I'm not an expert, so I can't adjudicate the merits of that claim in a legal sense. But from an institutional sense, the idea that the response by members of Congress to a problem is to say, "Oh, actually, the president should just solve that." It's an abdication of power, and a willingness to sort of transfer your own power to another branch because you want a certain outcome is, I think, again, concerning to me.
And we see it too in the way that this is playing out with just the eternal debate on continuing resolutions for the appropriations process. Every time Congress, passes another continuing resolution to just fund fund the government at the current levels, they take away their own prerogative to affect things. They take away their ability to say this money goes to this money goes to this, because the administration has a lot more leeway in a continuing resolution than it does if it's responding to directives. You have to spend this money in this manner from the Congress, and it's an abdication of the power of the purse, again, so people can just run to a television camera or run to their social media account and blast the other side.
Yeah, it's a real challenge to think about going forward, certainly over like the medium to the long term, let alone the very short term, which is, we're having this conversation on February 8th. We have about a month until the current continuing resolutions funding the government start to run out. There are two of them.
Yep.
I think they still have staggered expiration dates.
Yes. Yeah.
And so on one level, we're going to have to confront some of these questions very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly as a medium to longer term question, these bigger institutional separation of powers considerations are also at play.
Well, Molly, I don't want to end on a downer, but I don't know how else to end it. We are, as you said, this is February 8th. The Senate is still, they've tried a couple of different things with their, they were not able to proceed on a border Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel package earlier this week. They're going to try to strip out the border parts of it and just do the security parts to see, but it doesn't sound like that's a starter. So, nothing happens until something happens, I guess, is as good as I've got right now.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges to forcing action on this kind of supplemental piece is that my understanding is that the Ukrainians need help, and they need help as fast as we can get it to them. But there isn't necessarily, from the perspective of individual members of Congress, like a looming deadline where they will bear a really significant cost for not approving additional assistance to Ukraine. And I sort of sense the same is true of Israel. And obviously the politics of assistance to Israel are differently complicated than the politics of assistance to Ukraine. And so I think part of why, it's possible for Congress to sort of keep spinning its wheels on this is because there isn't this action forcing mechanism. So I don't know if this is, I don't want to be too optimistic, but I do think that one thing we should pay attention to in the next several weeks is whether it seems like whatever resolution to the funding for the fiscal year, for the rest of the fiscal year, for the rest of the discretionary appropriations process, whether that is at all a possible vehicle for moving any of this additional assistance to other countries in the national security space. And one reason why I think this is possible, I would not go as far as to say it's probable, but one of my sort of iron rules for watching Congress is, when people are mad about something, were they ever possibly going to support the thing that they are mad about? So if you think about the fact that particularly in the House and probably also in the Senate, the same people who are most sort of opposed to additional assistance to Ukraine are also people who were never going to vote for a spending deal that resolves the discretionary budget for the rest of the Congress. So like sort of the Freedom Caucus and their fellow travelers in the House, for example.
Yeah.
And so does that, and kind of the political consequences for Mike Johnson are very relevant here. But does that open a lane for the possibility of getting some of these other things done? And
on the suspension calendar.
On the suspension calendar, man, I expect that's how we'll keep the government open for the rest of the year, which is really my colleague Sarah Binder, who's also a Congress scholar, and I have been talking about the need to come up with sort of a new name for these bills that Johnson is using suspension of the rules for, because they're different than to go back to where we started this conversation, our traditional understanding of what suspension gets used for. Right. And so, there's always, it turns out, room for innovation in the House, even if why we're innovating it doesn't say a lot of things great about the near-term future of Congress.
I think that's a good spot to end. I feel relatively positive about that there is some innovation going on.
Yeah.
That you get into a pickle and then you have to get creative, and Johnson, to his credit, has been creative in this sense. Was it the consent calendar? I mean, there was this thing that they were trying to do where if you got enough people from enough,
the consensus calendar.
The consensus calendar. That's already taken, but maybe they can just they can rebrand it as this. So anyway. Molly, thank you as always for talking to us. I know that for some of the maybe non-political science people out there, the smoke may be coming out of their ears at this point, but I really enjoyed this conversation.
Smoke comes out of my ears sometimes, and I am a political science-minded person, yes. So I'm sympathetic to the listeners who are feeling that way.
Yeah, but also I just love having somebody to talk to about this kind of stuff, because it is a small universe, but it is a consequential one for everybody. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me.